straight to our first panel discussion. And I will also encourage the online audience to ask questions in the chat. We'll bring them in. So if I could invite to come up here to the stage Agustin Ibanez, director of BrainLat Institute. Yeah, Joel Rosenthal, president of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. Claudia, Chwalisz, CEO of DemocracyNext. And Upali, Nanda, Vice President of HKS. Warm welcome to all of you. Please take your seats. I think we have a few more here that we need, but there is a big panel coming up, so that's why. So when we first started to design the program for today's event, well, it was early 2024, and we realized what a year it's going to be, right, in terms of elections in no large part of the world, especially if you count on the population basis. Some of these elections have taken place, others are eagerly awaited, shall we say. And we will need to take stock of that one way or the other, right? At the end of the year, we'll need to move forward. So what we put in the title is that we both need a paradigm shift, and I'm curious whether you would agree with that to start with, and secondly that we need democratic renewal. And all of you are working day and night in that field for the democratic renewal. So we would be eager to hear more about it. But to connect it to the brain economy, I would like to ask Agustin to get us started and share with us some very exciting and recent research about how democracy and the brain relates to each other. We are all very eager to hear that, Agustin.
Thank you so much, Paweł. I will use the slides. I don't know if they are somewhere. So this is Agustin Ibanez, originally from Argentina. As you can recognize my broken English, I direct the Latin American Brain Health Institute, but also I am the program director of the Global Brain Research Project of the Global Brain Health Institute that is based at UCSF and in Trinity College. So I will try to bring up some wonderful ideas that I hear about brain capital, about complexity, and then try to move into democracy. So what I'm trying to convince you today is that, thank you, Anika, for your words, because you make my life very easy. We need to face complexity. We need to face transdisciplinarity. Otherwise, we are not going to succeed in that. I want to be very pushing about this idea. So Harris has already defined a brain capital that also saved my time now. I just want to say, that this idea of brain capital is not brain research, it's not neuroscience. It's a very transdisciplinary approach that brings body, that brings environment, and something that I want to highlight brings circularity. It's not how brain capital is going to impact the economy or how economy is going to impact brain capital. It's a circularity process. It's another word that we also sometimes have fears about that, and it's something that we need to change. So one simple example, sleep capital, right? So sleep capital is threatened by stress, by socioeconomic problems, but at the same time, it's a huge aspect required to improve productivity. If you don't sleep, you know how you feel the day after, right? But what is the problem with this approach? Most of the research that we do on brain health comes from the 10% of the population, and we try to use this as an universal model. From genetics to brain health, we just need to expand our knowledge. We need to create better models, better computational model facing complexity, bringing diversity not at age, gender, or race, across many other levels and across many inequalities. And we need to create more brain-body world models. This is one of the most challenging. I am pushing this idea. One of the most important editors in the world is considering this. I hope that this paper is still not yet rejected. So this is my friend Johnny Miller. He published this wonderful picture, South Africa showing the structural inequalities, and really inspired me about what happened in the brain. So you have right versus left, poor and rich, right? This is Juana, same brain, same person, living in a poor versus a rich country. She will evolve with a completely different brain in both situations. So she will have an allostatic interoceptive network in the brain that will create a more stressful response to environmental demands. She will have also a cardiometabolic system that is more fragile, especially vascular interactions with the amygdala, but she also will have many increased risk for dementia, inflammatory process, metabolic processes that are associated with different pathologies. Of course, she will have less opportunities for self-regulation. This is why we need to start to thinking in more ecological frameworks, more complex frameworks, right? So this is a case of Latin America. Latin America is an incredible, diverse population with genetics from Africa, Latin America, native, right, and European. But at the same time, it's one of the most unequal regions in the world after our colleagues in Africa, right? So we have already shown that the typical risk factor doesn't work well in Latin America, that inequity-related factors are really more powerful than the classical risk factors to predict aging, healthy aging, and dementia. We also shown that there are computational advances that allows us to handle the huge heterogeneity and multimodal diversity underlying these conditions. Instead, when you look at the brain data available in the world, we don't know almost nothing about socioeconomic impacts. When you look at the open data set, you just will find education or just poor measures of socioeconomic development. The same when you look at the brain correlate of high-level functional cognitive aspects, they don't work well in atypical, non-stereotypical, or diverse populations. And when you look at genetics interaction with environmental interaction, we don't know almost nothing, especially when we bring these admixtures with unique genetics mutations. So the framework that I want to push is neurosyndemics, bringing, all these interactions from, proteinopathies, from biological process to pathophysiological pathways, to whole body disease, to the context, to the environments, like a socioeconomic impact, but also democratic impact, as we will show later. Neuroscientists are feeling safe in the lab, but they have to go into the safari, into the real life to capture the cognition in the wild. This is a strong challenge that we are trying to do. Otherwise, that we know in the lab will not translate to the complexities in the real world. And this idea of embodied cognition should be moved towards an idea of embedded health. So the physical exposome from pollution, right? So, or social exposome like social determinants of health or socioeconomic factors impact in the brain. But at the same time, impact in the internal exposome, like the allostatic process that the body generates against these environmental factors, and also impacts our ability to develop the brain capital, right? So this is a very circular point. This is what I want to bring today. So we have shown that we need to create a more diverse science of the brain. So bringing the global south is extremely important because otherwise our models of brain health and brain capital are not going to work in every place of the world. And even, when you look at the biomarkers, for instance, the two most important genetic mutations that bring future hope for genetic interventions in dementia has been discovered in the global south, in Colombia, the Raylene mutation and the Christchurch mutations. So how we bring context into the brain, right? So a very simple study, we just look at a structural inequality with the Gini coefficient, right? It's a very poor metric of economic inequalities. But yes, with this metric, we found that this metric modulates brain signals more than age, education, or cognition. So we compare the brains of healthy people in aging, but also dementia, between US and Latin America, big difference in the brain. What these differences are explained by? Educational disparities. An incredible percentage of the variance was just explained by educational disparities. We also developed, very exhaustive assessment of social determinant of health or social exposome, from the childhood to the lifespan. And we've shown that this information truly impacts the whole spectrum of brain health, from cognition, functionality, neuropsychiatric symptoms, to the biological embedding of these inequalities, like brain structural and functional connectivity. We also shown, this is a paper that's forthcoming by Agustin, a wonderful postdoc, that again, the Gini coefficient have a simple linear impact in your brain. Reduce the volume and reduce your connectivity of the brain. That's simple. Even larger effects as any individual factor. So we need a tailored model, right? It's not going to work in a universal approach. The same idea can be now started to say, okay, so social exposome doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in the physical exposome. It also happens in the lifestyle individual factors. We don't have science to tackling this interaction. We are just starting to discover that. In this paper published 3 weeks ago, we shown that the TikTok of your brain, so the age of your brain, can be accelerated or delayed according where you live or what do you do. So we shown, first of all, that females have an older brain than males, especially if they come from Latin America. That patients with Alzheimer or frontotemporal dementia have an older brain than patients with mild cognitive impairment, and those have a longer age than healthy controls. But most interesting, we found where this accelerated aging was coming from. So not just neurocognitive disorder, but air pollution, socioeconomic inequality were strong modulators of this gap between the biological age of your brain and the chronological age. What can do to reverse these brain clocks? So Nisha Sagnani is a wonderful researcher. We are going to publish 6 papers in Lancet next year highlighting the impact of creativity and art on health. So we just started to do this. We studied the brain clocks in artists, in professional artists, and that we found is a systematic, less accelerated aging in musicians, tango dancers, painters, gamers, in comparison with non-experts, right? So we also have a very nice association between these brain clock metrics and experience of creative, and the performance and expertise in creative experience. Then we need to develop brain health measures. I am coming close to the democracy discussion, right? It takes a while. Yes. So we wanted to explore the association between behavioral metrics and your age. So we took 160,000 participants across the globe, and we created these models. Look at the map. So who are the oldest behavioral clocks? People from Africa, followed by Latin America, followed by Asia, followed by Mediterranean Europe, and then North Europe. So that tells us inequality. We have very nice association of these behavioral clocks to predict future decline. But the most interesting thing that I want to show, behavioral clocks are strongly influenced by different economic markers like representation, free political parties, inclusive suffrage, credible elections, and local democracy. So we need to really face complexity. Brain is not living in an isolated world. It's in a whole body health that is inserted in a contextual embedding, right? So we need to start to challenge these ideas. We need to create more robust computational models that can integrate this multi-level complexity. Brain capital needs to address multimodal diversity if we want to develop, key metrics of success. And we need to connect brain health with brain capital and economic and democracy progress. Otherwise, we will not impact on that. Sorry for the long talk, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Agustin. This is extremely fascinating and very pioneering research as well. I don't know if Claudia and Joel, especially working a lot on democracy, have come across this line of thought that the exposome, the totality of impacts that we experience in the world, be it environmental, be it social, or be it, as Agustin calls it, expanded exposome, which then includes democracy, that this is all that we have to take into account if we want to design practical and effective ways forward in reinventing democracy. I know that Upali has given this a lot of thought in terms of the built environment as a context for how we live and choices we make. Claudia, you started your work on democracy with a research on populism, and of course it has become, if anything, more relevant today than it was 10 years ago. We need to understand populism better, and we need to understand what people find attractive in different waves of populism. Is it the sense of agency that they feel they are losing in the world, or is it something else? And then you, in a very impressive way, took things into your own hands, so to say, establishing DemocracyNext 2 years ago. Just celebrated the 2-year anniversary. And DemocracyNext is, and you will tell us more about it, but it's really about doing what you preach, namely, if you posit that a deliberative democracy makes sense and is important, then you have to go out and actually do it in the real world, right? So I would like you to share with us some of your experience. I mean, what have been the learnings of these past 2 years? And also, to what extent deliberative democracy and representative democracy will find an equilibrium in this period ahead of us.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paweł, for that introduction, and really interesting research. I'd love to dive deeper into some of the details of it. So, as Paweł was saying, I've been working on, well, initially populism, that started 12 years ago or so on, but very quickly shifted to working rather on democratic innovation, which has been the focus of my work for the past decade in different guises. I was at the OECD for a while, so I'm familiar with a lot of the world that many of you share from the international organizations, but I left 2 years ago to found a new organization called DemocracyNext, which is a global platform for democratic innovation, and we're trying to shift who has power and how are we taking decisions together. And for the global community, we serve as both this knowledge hub and an action lab on ideas like citizens' assemblies, sortition, meaning the random selection of decision makers, and deliberation, which means collectively weighing evidence to come to shared decisions off the back of it. Because you mentioned the word deliberative democracy, but I find not everyone is really familiar even with those terms, and so just kind of defining what am I talking about, because I think today we've come to have a rather narrow definition of what we mean by democracy as elections, as a sort of shorthand, and actually historically speaking, taking a step back, that's actually quite recently in history as well. And so part of the work in a much broader way is actually about how do we expand this notion of democracy with these other ancient democratic principles that we are trying to bring back in contemporary ways. So when I was at the OECD, I led a big study looking into what now has over 700 examples of citizens' assemblies that have been convened by different public authorities around the world. And I'm talking about assemblies where there has been a selection of people by sortition, meaning people randomly selected from amongst the whole population that are convened together for lengthy periods of time to tackle all sorts of policy, legislative, constitutional issues. So, for example, in Ireland, one of the most well-known examples was the Citizens' Assembly, where 100 people from across Ireland were selected to deliberate on whether the country should change its constitution on same-sex marriage, on abortion, on various other issues, which led to referendums that did lead to that constitutional change. I live in France, where there was recently the French Citizens Assembly on end-of-life issues, which I think in a different way intersect with the topics we're talking about here. But to address that, the government had brought together 185 people that were selected at random from the whole French population to be broadly representative of the diversity of France. And they convened them about whether the existing legislation to do with end-of-life, assisted dying, and related matters to do with investing in end-of-life health should be changed, and if so, in what way. So they deliberated over the course of 27 days that were spread out over 4 months. They heard from over 60 different experts, and experts in a very broad sense. So they obviously heard from scientists and researchers and heads of the Psychological Association and so on, but they heard from faith group leaders and philosophers and people with lived experience of lifelong illnesses as well. And they developed what ended up being 67 recommendations for how the law should change that were written up in their own words in a 176-page report. So I elaborate on one example to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about, because I think this is a sort of new form of democracy. I mean, a contemporary form of a very old form of democracy, actually, that we're seeing a renewal of. And this is the sort of center of the work that we're doing at DemocracyNext. And I think why like what we've seen thus far has been a lot of one-off initiatives of this sort that depend a lot on political will. But I think if we're really thinking about the bigger picture and the impacts on society, because these processes are so powerful in giving people a sense of greater agency and dignity and capacity, both in recognizing that in people, but also in very actively strengthening all of those things, the impacts of that will obviously be limited if there's one assembly with 185 people happening once. But if we can imagine these sorts of assemblies taking place at all different levels of government on an ongoing basis, I think we have absolutely no shortage of big public policy questions that we could be having such deliberations on an ongoing basis in countries across the world. But also beyond that, bringing back these principles of how we do democracy into other organizations of our daily lives as well. So part of the other aspect of the work we're doing is also working with other institutions like museums and schools, universities, workplaces, to bring these ways of decision-making and governance into their ways of working. And so I think that there's a sort of knock-on effect we can be really thinking about and looking into if everybody actually on a much more ongoing basis has this more active role in democracy beyond going to vote once every 5 years. And I think the whole brain health conversation, just to wrap up my initial comments here, is interesting in those two ways. One, in that I think all the investment in brain health and capital strengthen the ability of more people to really, truly be able to take up those opportunities to participate. But I also think that by being members of such assemblies, we are also actually, it's another form of strengthening people's brain health, because they're actively creating these structured opportunities for people to be able to not just use those reasoning and analytical skills, but also really feel like dignified and worthy members of society and our shared democracies, which I think is also a vital part of this whole conversation.
Thank you so much. Extremely impressive, and I love the example which you gave. Yes, well, applause, well deserved. I love the example which you gave of the deliberation in Ireland on one of the most difficult issues that there could be in a society, right? The end of life debate, and how you go about it in an informed fashion, whom you listen to in order to make an informed opinion. It is extremely important that we open up to such perspectives and such experiences. Now, Joel, in your work, you focused on another P. So that P has been pluralism, and when I prepared for this discussion, I thought, well, there is, again, something, maybe I see the brain everywhere now, but there is something that relates to what we know from brain science in that P for pluralism, because it is about the associative nature of our societies on the one hand, but also it is about the reassertion of the role of the individual. And it is really about the balance between the two. So how would you see pluralism now changing, evolving, and adapting to the world we live in?
Great. Thank you, Paweł. Thank you. Is this on? Thank you for the opportunity to be here. When I thought about what my intervention could be in a gathering like this, it goes to that principle of pluralism. And if there's one takeaway for my presentation, I hope you'll think about this idea of pluralism as not just a philosophical principle, but something that's actionable in the ways that you were just describing. So what do I mean by pluralism? My short definition is empathy for diversity while recognizing what is common in the human experience. And I believe that brain science affirms our understanding of our natural capacities for both cooperation and conflict. So as human beings, we're hardwired to favor our own, leading to certain measures of tribalism. It's not surprising you started with populism in your career. At the same time, we're hardwired for empathy, leading to a certain capacity for collective action. And here I want to refer to the work of the scholar Joshua Green, who points out in his book, Moral Tribes, we operate first at the individual gut level, instinct, and then we move to a rational thinking mode, let's call it pluralism. That considers the interests and experiences of others. When we think fast, we think narrowly of ourselves. When we think slow, we can take a broader view that incorporates mutuality. Human survival needs both types of thinking. We need the fight or flight mode to handle immediate physical danger. We also need higher order thinking to facilitate cooperative arrangements. The challenge right now is that we're living in a time of fragmentation at exactly the moment when we need integration, or at least coordination. Globalization has sparked a backlash. Identity politics is on the rise. Global scale problems like climate change and migration are being met by local resistance. Leaders, or should I say demagogues, are seizing on this opportunity. It's easier to divide based on immediate fear rather than to unite based on long-term mutual self-interest. Now, it doesn't take brain science to understand this trend, but brain science and the brain economy might help us with a response. Now here, I want to refer to the work of the psychologist, the moral psychologist, Jonathan Haidt. Following David Hume, Haidt embraces the idea that emotions come first and reason follows. But rather than lament this fact, Haidt says we can work with it. Brain science and observation help us understand how humans are simultaneously selfish and selfless. Specifically, humans have the capacity for the I to become we. Now, as the cliche has it, most of us strive to become something bigger than ourselves. The human brain has the capacity and instinct to bind tightly to small groups, but also to find meaning as part of bigger entities such as our country, our religion, or even nature itself. Now, the reason I land on pluralism as the key virtue for democracy is that it accounts for difference while keeping in mind the common good. Now, as a realist, I think it's wise to have a minimalist goal for pluralism. Perhaps it's best to think of pluralism not as a quest for total agreement, but rather to manage disagreement. Democracy is a system by which we agree to live together with differences. Knowing how to effectively tap into cognitive biases to support a living with differences approach could be a game changer. The rise in populism suggests we're living in a moment of anti-pluralism. One of the reasons I'm here today is to ask all of you whether brain science and the brain economy can help us tell a story about pluralism that can help us navigate the anti-plural challenge.
Thank you so much, Joel, for this greatly inspiring thoughts, with also a homework question for us in the audience as well. And I'm looking at Michael Platt especially, who studies social connections and how we are wired to be social. And I will not resist the temptation, Michael, to come to you in a second if you don't mind. But before we do that, and please also, if you have comments or questions, I will open up very soon. But before we do that, Upali, I would like to go to you next, because you work a lot in making sure that the immediate space around us is conducive to our cognitive, emotional, and social balance and development. And when I was thinking about the amazing work you do at HKS and beyond, my question was, well, how do we scale that? How do we achieve an impact which is even remotely close to a societal one, if you know what I mean, right? Because it's great that you do this fantastic work for your clients, but I have, especially in this context of the discussion on democracy, the temptation to ask, well, how do we achieve impact at a high level? Sorry for posing a somewhat challenging question with that, but...
do you have any that were not challenging?
Well, hopefully, at some point.
The saving graces challenge is very good for the brain health, so that's good. First of all, I think one of the call to actions today is places for pluralism. Places for pluralism are not something we have easily, but if you look at the room right now, let's not go anywhere else. If you look at the room, there is a power dynamic. I'm here on a high chair. We are here, so we have the power. Our thoughts are going to you. You are in rows. You don't have the power right now. If in a second we reorganized and made this circular, we would change the dynamic in the room. Right? So places dictate power. Places give power, places take power. And places do it invisibly all the time, and we don't even realize it's being done. They're implicit orchestrators of power that we don't see today. And any organization you go to, any convening, any place, you can see a dynamic there. So that's where I would start, is they're invisible to us, even though they are the most visible manifests right now. Even now, in this moment, when some of you chose to walk around, some of you chose to get a drink, you decided what you needed, and this particular space gave you that affordance. It gave you some flexibility for your individual needs. If I had walls all around you and had closed you, I would have taken away that power. And by leaving the room, you would have become embarrassed sometimes to say, oh, I'm leaving, I'm going away. So first thing I'd like to say, Paweł, is the built environment does so much that we don't see and we don't ask for. How many designers, architects, planners in the room today? See, there lies the problem. The problem starts here, because those who are constructing our cities and our neighborhoods, where you can see the damn grocery store, but you can't get there. You can see everything on the map that's supposedly close to you, but you can't get there. That's a city planner, that's a neighborhood planner, that's a designer. Your air quality that we know affects your cognitive health, that's a designer, but that designer didn't learn in school how every design decision relates to the health of the body, the health of the mind, and the health of the brain. It's not part of our curriculum, nor is it part of the investor or the client's brief that says, I hold you accountable to these outcomes. I hold you accountable to pluralism. I hold you accountable to social connections that are more equitable. So that, I think, is where the change first happens, is ask more and realize that the places you're in hold power, and they force interactions in a way that we don't do it. in a school, in a learning environment, in a workplace. It happens all the time. And I'll share just a few slides to kind of frame this up. They will not be as robust as Augustin's, so do not expect that. I think this idea of brains, bodies, and biospheres is key. And I think the premise for us is really simple. Like when our environments promote health, we have healthy brains, bodies, and communities. When we have healthy communities, we make better decisions about people and planet. A true democracy of the people is a byproduct. So to me, I would take this position saying the stage we set isn't set up for the goals we have. Our environments are not set up for the goals we have. When you were showing your diagram of, what was the girl's name?
I'd say Quana, but...
Quana works. In the diagram for Quana, my eye was going to the environment because that distinction between the environment automatically decided that design of healthy environments is for the rich and it is not for the poor. And that's the decision we made because good design, and we'll hear about it in the panel in the afternoon, is about doing the most you can for the best outcomes with the resources you have. And resources are not infinite. So if you did a gray bond, I would love that the gray bond also has brick bonds, that every brick we lay is towards a brain health derivative, imperative, whatever we call it. I think this idea of brain building for us has taken root for years now. It's in the places we work, in the places we learn, in the places that we live in. And housing is one of the biggest challenges, that the places we live in are not conducive to brain health. I won't get into this in detail, but I will say one of the things everybody can do is make their own organizations a living lab. We've started doing that with our offices, that we have a few offices that are living labs for brain health, which include brain training, design, but also habits. Our habits are not brain healthy. We know what's good for the brain, but we don't know how to do it. Right? There's a gap between knowledge and action, and places can really promote that. I, again, in the interest of time, won't go into findings, but in our living lab, we have realized that if you are intentional about space and the use of space and the use of time, which we don't talk about enough, you can actually reduce multitasking, increase focus, and increase the number of innovative moments in a day. So again, I'm going through these fast because that's not, I don't want to pause at the findings, but that's something we can share. It's being published right now. And all of the places have a call out, and this is designing with intent for why are you designing this way, and what's the outcome, cognitive outcome that you want. This is impossible to read, but I will just talk about the framing. The framing is every design feature should have a business impact. Here we could say the square footage and the cost was actually reduced, yet multitasking was also reduced, the number of focus tasks were increased, and the ability to connect with each other increased. If everything we designed, if every investment asked about business impact and human impact and planet impact, immediately the conversation changes. Ask us about what design can do. And then this, I just wanted to show that in the end of it, like this is another brain healthy workplace that is designed. It's an adaptive reuse project, so it's extremely sustainable. It's designed with limited resources because we had a very shoestring budget. But I wanted to end with this slide because this is just an event happening. This is an event like ours. There's good food, we're sharing knowledge, there's great art in the background, they're inspiring minds. It's not rocket science. But it's really important that the lived experience is something we celebrate at the end of the day. Do diagnostics very intentionally. When you were asking me, Paweł, why can't we scale? We can't scale because the conversation about place happens with different people, about people happens with different people talk about process and technology. So to your question about systems, how will we make systemic change because we have siloed responsibilities? We can only do system change when your role is my responsibility in some ways. So I think that's one of the things we wanted to end with. I wanted to also call out that AARP has started a brain health action. Some of us in the room are part of that, and there is a pillar now on music, arts, and design, which makes me so happy because we are bringing the built environment into the conversation. Harris and Rajiv and I worked on a paper on cities for longevity, which were all around brain health too. So this conversation that started with Harris years ago has become a movement now, which I find is incredible. And that's the thought I would end with, is how do we scale? We build for brains together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Upali. I think the first thing that all of us will do after going back to our organizations is to rearrange the space, or at least to reflect if that space needs to be rearranged. But if I could have a quick follow-up question, when you approach people with this brain building idea, I mean, what sort of traction do you get? I mean, do most people immediately get what you are talking about,
Not
or is
at all.
it very difficult?
I was at a meeting yesterday with a very large healthcare system. And we talked about how important it was for healthcare systems to design for the brain. And I got such blank looks. You're like, what? So health and well-being, I think, is better understood right now. But the idea of brain health, even for healthcare systems where you have departments for neurology, you know caregivers are getting burnt out. You know at every level this is an important derivative. It is not even in the vocabulary right now. And certainly not, and I keep saying that's why we have to go up to change what the brief asks for. Yeah. Because when you already have saying, give me a hospital with 200 rooms, there is no ask for brain health in that brief.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm looking around if there are any comments or questions. Michael, I don't want to put you under the spot, but I think.
How many hours do I have? So it's a little bit awkward, but and I will be speaking later today about the work of the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. But you mentioned social connection, and that topic has come up a lot here. So I'll talk about my day job, which is running a research lab in the School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and where we study human behavior, human social connection, decision making, and human brains. And we also do the exact same thing in monkeys. And so that comparison and contrast and the ability to go to a deeper level allows us to uncover something that I think is really important, which is that everything that we talked about here is not really uniquely human. So it reflects a deep biological heritage. So monkeys, just like humans, the stronger their social connections, just like humans, the longer they live, the healthier they are, the more successful they are. This is the result of a dedicated processing network in our brains, which we call the social brain network, which manages our moment-to-moment interactions as well as our long-term relationships. That network is stronger, bigger, if you will, higher functioning in people who have more connections, people who have more friends, and the same thing is true in monkeys, okay? This is critical to how we navigate the world and how we respond to stressors. And we already heard that from Agustin. It's really important. Monkeys face the exact same kinds of challenges. So inequality, environmental insults, climate change. And one of our research programs is focused on a population of thousands of monkeys on an island off the coast of Puerto Rico. We've been studying them for 17 years. We have data on every single animal. We follow them around. We recognize them. It's remarkable in terms of granularity. And we also have all kinds of physiological data. Okay. What we find is that monkeys who are higher status, they actually have younger brains at the molecular level, right? So they're actually younger, which means they're higher functioning. We also studied the impact of a major climate change exacerbated stressor, in this case Hurricane Maria in 2017, hit the island of Puerto Rico, caused 3,000 deaths, unleashed a tidal wave of anxiety, depression, suicide, you name it. It hit our monkey island first, okay? All the monkeys survived. There was an uptick in mortality after that. But then they had to deal with this ravaged environment. Everything was destroyed. All the trees were killed. It's 8 degrees hotter. What do we find what happened? aging accelerated. Just experiencing 1 year of that hurricane, the monkeys aged 2 years. That's about 8 years for us. I don't think any of us wants that to happen. We've tracked them for the 7 years after that hurricane. Monkeys who made more friends, who were more connected, more tolerant, less aggressive, systematically lived longer. Okay? And that was their response, right? They aged extremely rapidly. We continue to see that. Their response was to, and these are aggressive monkeys, to become friendly, tolerant, reach out, make connections. And the reason they're doing that is because it's valuable. It helps them adapt and survive. Now, you see that in people, but it only lasts for like a couple of months after a disaster or a terrorist attack. You know, after 9/11, New Yorkers got really nice for a while, but you know, they couldn't keep it up. So I think there's something we can learn from these really wonderful animals in terms of, you know, how we can build this back into our own societies and culture.
Great, excellent, Michael. Thank you so much. And you will come back in the brain skills session. I'm still looking around if there are any comments or questions that I could have missed. Yes, please. So let's take this question. I also have one for the final round.
Yes. Hi, I'm Nelida Quintero, and I'm an environmental psychologist and an architect, and I've practiced in both fields, and I teach. So this is a really super interesting conversation. And one thing that I have found is that in doing this kind of research, I've specifically looked more at well-being and the physical environment, that the literature is all over the place. It's almost like we don't talk to one another. There is a lot of literature on this topic in psychology and environmental psychology field, but it's everywhere. It's urban planning, and there's architecture on this side, sociology, it's like everywhere. And some of the literature and the literature reviews refers to literature on the same topic, but within a discipline, right? So there's like, there'll be literature reviews that mention all psychologists in the psychology journals. There'll be literature reviews that mention all, even, let's say, neuroscientists on a more medical-oriented article. And I'm wondering if that is something that you notice, that this same pluralism doesn't exist within the academic fields. And it's always puzzling to me, because I end up really across so many disciplines. And the research is sometimes almost replicated, but from a different perspective. So that's all I wanted. I'm wondering if you have something to add to that.
Great, thank you so much. Brim.
Thank you very much. I have one question, since this session is about democracy and brain capital. I haven't heard anything about critical thinking, and you mentioned your work on populism, and now you're talking about innovative democracies. We've seen from the research of Agustin that there is really connection between economic models and brain health overall, beyond the fact that, absence of disorder. So how do you see critical thinking in our democratic systems today essential for preserving what I call the new stage of democratic systems, if we want to keep them as the central part of our free economic models?
Brilliant, thank you so much. Yes, on the back, how do we do this? We go and walk, which is good for our brain health.
Thank you. Okay, hi, I'm Daniel. I run an indoor air quality consultancy. To that end, I think in rooms like this, there's more of a common sort of goal towards the social good. Maybe when you leave rooms like this, most of the world is operated in a more profit-driven, less social good-oriented way. And maybe a lot of the companies that sort of pose as though they are participating and adding to the social good are only doing so in a performative way. We know that a lot of this work can actually have, obviously, like a tangible impact on performance, which in theory could increase profits for people. thus adding to their selfish wants. How do you translate that to the kinds of people who sort of hear these topics and it goes in one ear and out the other, and they see it as maybe something to be ignored if their main goal is that sort of selfish success? How do you translate this into a tangible benefit for a company and people in the private sector?
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, no more questions. I have one for the final round, which, if you don't mind, I would like to share now, and then you can. And then we get one extra panel to answer. You get extra panel, exactly, and that one last question goes to what Joel said at the end, namely that pluralism is a quest to manage disagreement, and I'll be super interested in your takes on that, namely how do we go about it? Do we need to establish some basic parameters of the exercise, or is it, an entirely open one to start with? There was an argument that someone made recently for the Ministry of Truth to be established, for example, which goes to the point that we are so disoriented in terms of the information that we receive that we no longer often know what is true and what is not, and in a democratic discourse one needs to establish the argument when, right? I mean, you can disagree with it, but the argument was that you need to know what is true and what is not in order to arrive at sensible decisions, otherwise you will definitely not get there. So if we could maybe start with that and anything that you want to add to in order to address the questions. Joel,
No, I'd be happy to kick it off with just a very brief intervention. First of all, why democracy? Well, democracy goes to the recognition of the equal worth of every person, and also giving each person their just due, their rights, right, and to recognize them as an individual. And it also gives us the idea of giving everybody the capacity to think for themselves, right? This is what democracy is all about. It's sort of that struggle for recognition, which I think feeds into the well-being idea, and that's just the core piece. This is maybe a diversion, and it might be better for later today, but we haven't talked at all about social media. We haven't talked at all about that as being sort of a force for fragmentation and division, trying to create some kind of common. When you were talking about spaces, right, we have our physical space, but as we all know, we're living in a virtual world. So I think that's really one of the frontiers for pluralism now, how to manage that in this sort of post-truth environment. So I'm afraid I have more questions than answers. The only thing I would just say is I do feel that principle of pluralism gives us a place to meet and to have a dynamic discussion to sort of figure out what that means.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Claudia?
Oh, this panel requires like way more time in terms of all the things to come back to. I think just in terms of some closing reflections and thoughts, I really loved your mention about space and the interdisciplinary nature of how we need to do things. We have a paper coming out next month that's been written with some of my architect colleagues about spaces for deliberation, reflecting on the physical nature, but I'm realizing in the wider interdisciplinary group we worked with, we didn't work with anyone working on neuroscience or brain health or anything like that. So this is partly a kind of invitation actually for anyone who's interested in some of these intersections to continue a conversation around that. And I was also thinking in relation to your work, Joel, that another one of my colleagues has written a paper around deliberation as an antidote to authoritarianism, which touches, I think, on some of the questions that Rim was alluding to, but I think there's something about what are those enabling conditions that allow us to be able to even engage in a pluralistic way? How do we design spaces that enable us to be with the complexity of the issues and not only reason and have critical thinking, but as you were referencing Heid's work, also recognize that emotions are a part of it, and actually being able to acknowledge that embodied aspect in the physical spaces we're in. So I think there's some very nice things there. And I think maybe just two tiny things to end with too is one of the things I would love to do, and if there are people here who would like to explore collaborating on, is I also think we really need some better metrics around democratic innovations and what we mean by some of these new democratic spaces and initiatives, and what is the relationship then with the brain economy and also other indicators that we're interested in, because all the democracy indices today are so focused on elections that we don't even have the data or the understanding about the relationship between these things. And then I think just briefly, because there was a question related to, or like a part of the question related to, we're talking about all of this in an era of technological transformation as well, and we didn't really talk about that aspect in all of this too. And I think there's a real need to be intentional and thoughtful about what we mean about how we're using technology or not. I know in the work where I'm doing on democratic innovation, there's diverging philosophies in terms of some people wanting to design technology almost as a replacement for the need for some of this human stuff. Like, how do we make these processes more efficient and shorter, and could we do them just online, and people could vote on stuff or like comment on each other's text. And to me that's like partly missing some of the point of what problems are we trying to solve, and this very human dimension of needing to come together for the lengthy periods of time. But that doesn't mean technology can't be enhancing the quality of that in-person process. So I am kind of working in that space, but I think it's just an important kind of dimension to this wider conversation that would be happy to have conversations outside of this panel on too.
This would be indeed fascinating, because when we look at the institutions of democracy, no, they haven't changed that much compared to the world around them, and technology included. And it is important to pose the question, why has that been, right? I mean, at the outset of the latest technological wave, I think there was more optimism that perhaps technology could be geared towards improving the democratic discourse. This has not materialized to the fullest extent, let's put it that way, but I don't think we should lose hope that it can be done in the future, right? Upali.
I think the questions were great. I would say that the transformation from the physical to the digital, the term phygital is now out there. That is very much our world. Trying to separate those two worlds out is almost impossible, and that is a design, again, it's a big design driver right now. Thank you for joining our panel, because the idea of being able to study behaviors in monkeys, we can't study ourselves with that depth.
Well, you wouldn't want to have me following you around all day, writing down what you do.
I'm game. You would just put like a chip on me and that would follow me around all day. I think there was a really good question that comes back to democracy around research and different disciplines. And I do think we need to talk about this issue of disciplinary arrogance, that every discipline comes up with its own arrogance and says, I know this and I know this really deeply, and not enough towards, and enough investment, I would say, towards impact. Saying, if we brought these together, would you be able to make a difference? What would this difference look like? How would we measure it? What does that mean?
So I want to, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Speak to the question of fragmentation from the perspective of neuroscience. So one of the things that we've learned over the last decade is that when we have a close relationship to somebody, our brains begin to resonate. They synchronize. The higher the synchrony, the greater the trust, the better the communication, the better the collaboration and cooperation. One of the most effective tools, which is just built into our DNA, at least 200,000 years, best tools for synchronizing is conversation. Mm-hmm. When we talk to somebody, have a real conversation, give and take, and we listen, that moves two people who are strangers into greater synchrony. What's happening now? Polarization, social media, it's exactly the opposite. So we need to find mechanisms. It's simple, right? to actually talk to each other. And I think it's probably easier in the real world, in the physical world, than online.
I agree, and I think that's a great follow-up to this idea that research papers can't talk to each other. So you need people, and you need projects, that say, really what we want at the end is an outcome like this. This is what the impact investment looks like, and then you bring the disciplines together, and they have to talk each other's language because there's a shared return on investment. This idea of co-benefit frameworks is very important, where we can talk the business language, we can talk the human language, we can talk the planet language, and understand what do we prioritize that benefits the most stakeholders in the most humane and effective way possible.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. So if there is space where the research papers do talk to each other, I think it's the exposé space, the exposé space, which Agustin talked to us about, namely the totality of the influences, right? But the final question, and concluding one that I would have for Agustin, is how do you design interventions on this basis, right? Because exposome by definition is extremely complex. So what do we do in order to then take this knowledge and define the right types of interventions?
Wonderful question and wonderful panels, wonderful discussions, so many things to think about. You're pointing at great points, right? So my approach to democracy is like an extended exposome, right? It shouldn't be this way. And I think that there is so one important thing is to consider the structural determinants. If we don't put attention for that, we will put all the effort in individual behavioral change, and we are going to fail.
Yes.
So this is something that we need to take care when we talk about economy, democracy, and bring health. This is essential. But at the same time, I think that there are opportunities. Hearing Claudia and Joe, this idea is really important because, you know, when we create a sense of we, the power of us, when we trust each other, when we create empathy, we are perhaps renewing our idea of democracy. Today, you know, with misinformation, with all postmodernism and AI, democracy is going down. Right? So how we can renew democracy can be a path to create a sense of agency, to empowering us that have a huge impact in the biological embedding. That reduces stress, reduces inflammation, improves your brain, right? So I think that that could be an easy way in this very complex situation and how to induce changes, even in societies that are unequal, even in, you know, people with underserved conditions, because the sense of agency is the last thing that you can lose and you can recover with your community, perhaps, right?
Great, thanks so much. I think this has been the most unconventional discussion on democracy I can recall, but perhaps there is a reason for it, because just as we need to rearrange chairs in order to get different chemistry in the room, we also need to rearrange things a little bit in a democratic context to produce better outcomes. So a lot to think about. A big thank you to all the panelists and everyone who joined the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to steal
We
your
need to
paper
catch
because
up a
all your
little bit on
script is written
time,
there, and I
so
wanna read all of
we
it.
have a coffee break now, but we have to meet again here in 15 minutes to start the systemic investing panel, which will be equally exciting.